Good afternoon. My name is Lindsay, and I am a first-year PhD student in the UBC Social Justice Institute.
And my name is Shannon, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a second-year master's student at the Social Justice Institute as well. And we're happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us for our first event of the panel series, Just Futures, Thinking Through Abolition and Transformative Justice. This series has been organized by the Social Justice Institute's Graduate Student Association, and we would like to begin by acknowledging that our work at UBC takes place on the ancestral, unceded, and stolen territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. While we are gathering virtually today, we are each living on Indigenous land across Turtle Island, and we encourage everyone to learn about whose land they're living on, as this is a crucial step towards decolonization. We hope that our engagement with abolition and transformative justice through this panel series will engender fruitful discussions and insights on building solidarity across decolonial and abolitionist movements. This panel series was created in particular to engage with the UBC community as well as wider academic, activist, and artist communities in conversations on anti-Black racism and abolition following recent instances of racial profiling on UBC's Vancouver and Okanagan campuses. In response to these instances, last year, our GSA created a working group to research UBC's policies for handling racial profiling. But other than an external investigation, UBC has done little to address the root causes of racial profiling on campuses, and has instead used COVID-19 as a reason to increase surveillance. As a result, this panel series was created in the hopes of sparking community dialogue on abolishing police, prisons, and colonial violence, and enacting transformative justice within UBC and beyond.
So let me now introduce our panelists for today. So Elle Jones is a poet, a journalist, educator, activist, and scholar. She is the author of From the Afrikan Resistance, which uses poetry to explore issues including feminism, prison justice, and abolition. Elle Jones was the 5th Halifax poet-laureate and recipient of the 2016 Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her work in community and prison justice. She co-founded Black Power Hour, a live radio show hosted on CKDU that blends hip hop with discussions of political, cultural, and social issues relevant to Black people. She also recently received a PhD in cultural studies at Queen's University. And then Vicki Chartrand is a mama and associate professor in the sociology department at Bishop's University, as well as an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa. So her current research is concerned with historical and contemporary links between the criminal justice system and settler colonialism, Indigenous grassroots work to address violence against Indigenous women, and alternative understandings and practices of justice and accountability. In addition to her research, she's also the recipient of the 2017-2018 Divisional Teaching Award, the founder and director of the Center for Justice Exchange, and the prisoner struggles editor for the Journal of Prisoners on Prisons, and also sits on several editorial boards. So welcome, Elle and Vicki. We're honored to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I feel like they're all colonial titles, but anyway, okay. Great to be here.
I hate them. I always feel like know me by my words and my deeds, you know.
Of course, yeah.
Well, thank you so much again to the both of you. I guess to kick things off, we wanted to ask both of you about how instances of racial profiling like those on UBC's campuses are deeply entangled with Canadian practices more broadly of policing, incarceration, surveillance. So kind of the follow-up to that, what I guess would be like, how are instances of racial profiling connected to the work that you do, particularly with prisoners and for prison abolition? Would you like to go first, Elle?
Yeah. Yes, I'll go first. I was trying to make you go first, but I'll go first.
Okay.
I actually just recently watched a talk on Friday by Dr. Charmaine Nelson, who people may be familiar with, who does work around representations of Blackness in art history, but of course also uncovering the slavery history of Canada. And one of the things she talked about was that Blackness itself is a surveillance technique by white people, right? So the whole enslavement of Black people and chattel slavery is also predicated upon this idea that because Black people have a visible Black skin, unlike other groups who are indentured. So we know the Irish were indentured. We know that there's, Indian people are indentured in the Caribbean. Like there's indentured servitude, but of course nothing that is the same as chattel slavery. And that is particularly marked by a marking of Blackness, right? So this idea that Black skin is therefore a sign that you cannot be a member of this free society. So any Black person who's visibly walking around, therefore, is under surveillance by their very body, right? And this is embedded into the very laws of slavery, the social structure that emerged from enslavement, and this is present in Canada as well. So when we start to understand that Blackness itself is marked as always a surveillance technology, we begin to perhaps understand why still in 2020 or 2019 or 2021, or whatever years we're talking about, we continue to be profiled and surveyed. That is built into the very nature of how Blackness relates to a white supremacist settler colonial society. So of course, when we look in, this is, by the way, not, I mean, I know that you're responding to a specific incident. We can also think of course, what happened at Acute, a very similar issue with a student from Nova Scotia, Shelby McPhee, who was profiled when the conference was at UBC and was accused of stealing a laptop. And these are all embedded into a criminalized idea of Blackness, right? That we do not fundamentally belong to the public. We do not belong to public space. The very notion of public safety is predicated on the idea that some people deserve safety, and those are the members of the so-called public, which always excludes Indigenous people, Black people, other racialized people, immigrants, people who use drugs, sex workers, queer and trans people, people with mental illness, people living with disabilities. The list is long, right? Unhoused people. All of us are not seen as members of the public, and therefore this thin blue line that the police represent is in place to police us, which is a fundamentally colonial image, right? So the entire point of policing is to police us out. Robin D.G. Kelly writes a lot about the blackening of public space, right? And this idea, for example, that, and we can relate this to the convoy, right? That we can think of Afrofest being policed in Toronto, right? And always being shut down. I think it was when they had held Caravana outside of Toronto. I can't remember which suburb it was, but remember when they shut down Caravana, they actually had, an individual act, a huge act coming in, international act. This is tourism, but they still shut it down for noise complaints. And then we can compare this, of course, to white people who are able to blare their horns in Ottawa for 10 days running, disrupt the entire city, and of course, face none of that policing. Now, this is not a call for policing, right? The error that people be making is being well, why don't you just police them? And of course, this is what abolitionists have to contend with, right? That we are not looking for the policing of everybody like Black people police, or the policing of everybody like Indigenous people are policed. So when we comment on something like the convoy and say, notice how, injunctions are passed for Indigenous people within 24 hours, yet these white supremacists can occupy Ottawa, the answer isn't therefore they should be policed. The answer is to recognize that the police are doing what they actually do, which is upholding white social order, right? This is what they're intended to do. So when they're not policing out truckers, that is their job. So our role isn't to call for more police, it's to recognize that this is what the police actually do. And therefore, we should be questioning why we need police and what their actual role is. But that's one example of recognizing that it's not even just Black bodies. Black people is seen as contaminating space in particular ways. We contaminate the airspace with our music. Any Black person who's been in a university has experienced sitting in your office and having security being like, are you supposed to be here? Can I see your ID? As if you just broke into an office to mark somebody else's paper, right? But it's that idea of fundamentally being out of place. And then when we look at Canada's history, Shireen Razik has talked about this in Race, Space, and the Law, right? That the whole settler colonial mythology is based upon an idea of an open, empty space with no Indigenous people, all erased. White people come and tame that land, so therefore claim it. And it's seen as wild. And the wildness of the land is tied to the wildness of the people, right? And then everybody else is a latecomer and a newcomer to the Canadian project. So therefore, we are subordinate. We should always be grateful, and we never belong, right? So, we see this enacted all over the place. And this is why Black people are racially profiled no matter where we go, whether that's a store, whether that's a school, whether that's running outside at night, as I do. And if my partner comes with me, he gets policed all the time as a darker skinned Black man. And we can go on and on about this, but I think that it's really important to recognize that these kind of surveillance technologies have been built into the existence of Black people in this country and in this continent, since we arrived here, right? Whether that's Lantern laws, Simone Brown talks a lot. I know you're grad students, so I'm giving you the sources in case people need, the work. Simone Brown talks about this obviously in Dark Matters, like the lantern laws in New York State, where Black people had to walk around carrying a lantern at night to literally light ourselves, right? And as a form of surveillance. She talks about the slave ship as a form of surveillance, right? Packing Black people into the slave ship, and points out that many people go back to the Panopticon to talk about surveillance, but ignore the slave ship and how slavery was a surveillance system. And she argues, and I agree, that anti-Blackness is therefore built into the entire history of surveillance itself. And those technologies, and I said, beginning with the surveillance of our skin tone, are fundamental to this social order, to the political order, to the organization of the state, whether that's at the border and the way that we're policed there, whether that's how we're policed on the streets, whether that's obviously incarceration. I know we're going to talk more about that, policing through child welfare, policing through forensics, and like the labeling of Black people as pathological in particular ways. At every particular site, you're going to see in hospitals, schools, right? Like wherever we are, we face this kind of profiling and criminalization as a result of the marking of Blackness, as us being seen as obviously the extraction of our labor under capitalism, our role as property, our role as the unhuman. And I'll stop talking because obviously I could now give a dissertation, and I will let Vicki speak, but that's a really like rapid fire summary of, I guess, Canadian history and Blackness.
Oh, I could keep listening, Elle, but yeah, thanks for that incredibly insightful and detailed response. I want to build on that. I'll probably tell this in a bit of a story, just to give it, not because I'm trying to navel gaze too much, but to give it some relational context. And I do want to just acknowledge that I am on the beautiful and unceded territories of the Abenaki people, and it's an honor and privilege for me to be here. And thanks for inviting me. But I come to my abolition work as an anti-violence worker, and I started going into the prisons about 25 years ago, almost 25 years ago now. And I actually come from abuse, and it wasn't hard for me to make the link between what I had been experiencing in my own life and my own growing up with what I had been seeing in prisons, and the kinds of oppression, but dominance, and that was happening in the pedantic violence that you'd see happening within the prison environment. So I came at this from an anti-violence work, but it wasn't until I actually started working in a women's shelter where I started to get the just or a better colonial and racial framework for it. And when I got to the shelter, there's 16 beds, but there was only about 2 or 3 women in the shelter, and I was like, what's going on here? Because I know that violence is, it's endemic to our very social fabric. And the workers, as I worked there for a while, the workers would tell me, that they can't let certain women in because they're addicted, or they're violent, or they're dangerous. And what was interesting to me is like, oh, that's, here, when I did all my prison work, the same discourses and labels that we were using on people who had created, consider having committed crimes, created social harms, were also being applied to the women who were ostensibly victims. And I needed to have a better sort of analysis. It's where I started to integrate a colonial and racial framework to understand it, because it was primarily the Indigenous women who were being denied access and support to the resources. So it was the people and the women who needed the support and the resources the most that were the least likely to be able to receive them. And so I applied this when I started to look at it. I started to look at this colonial framework to better make sense of my anti-violence work. And colonial is not just about, it's certainly about, colonizing lands, but it's also colonizing people's bodies and minds. And this is building on what Elle's been talking about, but race provides that kind of bifurcation that allowed entire populations to be enslaved, to have entire populations to be eliminated, for lands to be stolen, right? So it was race became, and then gender and sexuality, they started to create all these bifurcations, and it was through colonialism that these practices and techniques of colonialism. So whether it's the abuse that I was experiencing at my, in my own home, to the prison system, to the services that those Indigenous women are being denied, even to, the racial profiling that we're seeing on campus, is that kind of, it's that way to maintain whether it's the prison industrial complex to maintain white supremacy or white presence, or whether it's to steal lands or exploit lands. It's this kind of colonial framework that continuously is embedded in our very fabric that lets us, that continues to let us, these kinds of racialized practices that we're seeing. So, and I think, or as Ella was talking about earlier, we see people happening on Capitol Hill, right? It's white men inserting their presence, inserting their supremacy. So for me, it was really important to start looking at it from this colonial perspective, that and the colonizing of people's bodies and minds.
Great, thanks so much to both of you for that really great intro. Kind of, I guess, linking what you were saying, Vicki, about this kind of colonial violence. I'm wondering if you can move to question 2, and I'm wondering if you can, speaking to both of your experiences, working with prisoners, as well as other vulnerable communities that have been policed. We're kind of wondering, what are some key insights that you can both offer about how Canada's prison system uniquely functions to criminalize and incarcerate Black and Indigenous folks, as well as other people of color. And yeah, I know we've already been kind of getting into it a little bit, but I don't know if Elle, if you want to jump off.
Well, I don't know if it's unique. And I think we actually see, of course, colonial practices shared among various states. And of course, one of Canada's core mythologies is that we are unique, that we're the kinder, gentler partner to the US. This doesn't happen here. That's just the American South. Mass incarcerations, police shootings are in the South. Our last police chief before this one used to call it the Ferguson effect and claim that, we only believed there was police violence because we were all contaminated by watching TV from the States. He was big on this. So there's a long-standing history of course, Canada marking itself, unlike US exceptionalism, which is around a sort of settler colonial, manifest destiny narrative. In Canada, we like to pretend that we have some sort of alternate history of colonialism that somehow isn't violent, right? And that's what we're always trying to fight. So I think it's important to recognize that, of course, Canada's system is embedded in our history. These techniques are shared around all of these states. They emerge from various colonial practices. So whether we're talking about, apartheid emerging from the reservation system in Canada and then being exported into South Africa, and then it's brought back to us in other ways through clearances of neighborhoods. And we're constantly recycling and reliving the same moments through colonialism, the same techniques that are being updated, right? So I think it's important to also place us in that global context of anti-Blackness, of anti-indigeneity. We know the number one threat to the money in Canada is Indigenous sovereignty, right? That's the threat to the pipelines. That's the threat to natural gas. That's the threat to the cash. And that is why Indigenous people are massively criminalized to this day, which is part of the ongoing genocide of Indigenous people in the Americas since, 1492, right? So those continuums are important to draw. With that said, obviously, some basic stats. I don't always like to talk in stats, it's kind of, but just so that we have an idea of what we're talking about. We know that, nearly 50% now of federally incarcerated women are Indigenous women. There is no crime wave of Indigenous women in Canada. You're not going to walk out on the street and just be jumped by Indigenous women behind a bush, right? So we recognize that this is largely connected to the history. It is connected. It is part of the history of abuse of Indigenous women, violence towards Indigenous women, attacking Indigenous women and girls through sexuality, through removal, through genocide, through the Indian Act, which of course wrote out Indigenous women from their own nations, and so on and so forth, right? And of course, the prison is the latest version of that. And many people talk about the prison in Canada as the new residential schools, recognizing the exact same forces of RCMP, of policing, of state acts, of, all these things are present in the prison system. We recognize that we have a huge amount of people in prison who are Indigenous, not because Indigenous people are committing all these crimes, but literally because this is the technology for removing Indigenous people from the land and therefore from their nations, and therefore weakening Indigenous sovereignty, which of course, again, goes back to the Indian Act and literally defining who is a member of a nation, who is Indigenous. If you marry a white man and you're a woman, you can't be Indigenous, right? This is the same idea. So like, I don't know, what do you say about the prison in Canada? I mean, we're also, we always think that Black incarceration is a US thing. In fact, Black people are 10 times over incarcerated in Canada, although that logic of over and disproportionate is a bit dodgy, because it's like, what's an acceptable number of as long as we meet the census, like, as long as there's 1.3% of Black people in prison, like, we're obviously not advocating for that. We're advocating for an end to prisons and alternates to punishment that actually recognize that prisons don't work to do what we want. But I think, if you deal with the prison in Canada, it's what I call the violence of the paperwork, which you see throughout the Canada bureaucratic system, whether that's in child welfare, the immigration system. Anybody who's had to deal with a system in Canada, and not just Canada, but since we're in Canada, I mean, if I could cite the Abdul Abdi case, for example, which was the case of a child refugee who had come to Nova Scotia, was taken into the foster care system with his sister Fatuma, was not given citizenship. And then when he was an adult and he was criminally charged, they wanted to deport him to Somalia because they had never got him citizenship, even though he was in the care of the state. So that's a failure of paperwork, right? Somebody just didn't fill out the form. And then they're like, oh, well, I'm sorry, the wheels have to keep turning. Like, we just have to send you to Somalia to die. Like, what do? Nobody filled out the form, right? Like, this form of violence, the violence that you see for women in particular, generationally through like the child welfare system, right? Which is intergenerational violence. If you're involved in the system, your baby before they're even born is on the list and being reported on. And then we have birth alerts, right, that have just been so-called banned, which were almost entirely Indigenous women. Literally before you've even had the chance to be a birthing parent, they're like, okay, we're taking your baby off your breast, and like, because you're not going to be a good mother. And this is embedded, of course, in ideas of colonial whiteness, of white femininity, of ideal motherhood that Black people, Indigenous people, Muslim people, immigrants will never fit into, right? So like, you'll see it in the prison, of course, like the files that follow you. We see it for queer and trans bodies, the difficulty in changing birth certificates and having to pay for these papers that monitor and police your bodies. And these all connect to this institution of the prison, right? And if you deal with it, it's that mundane, just everyday, like, it's both extreme violence, like literal violence, like guards kneeling on people's necks until they die and then like wiping the tapes, what happened to Ashley Smith, what we've seen happen over and over again in prison deaths, like not calling healthcare, ignoring people when they hit their button so the ambulance doesn't come, actual violence by guards, pepper spraying people, dragging people into the showers and waterboarding them, all the ways that we could describe how people die and are abused in prison. And then things like the daily lockdowns that have become just a function of COVID and supposedly health insecurity, where everybody's just in their cells now for 23 hours a day. When I started doing prison work directly in like 2013, people were still out like 8-10 hours a day. 4 is good now. And that's just become normal. If people are out for like 4 hours a day, you're like, yay, you're out, And it used to be people are out all the time, and we've just accelerated the system. So now you're not out, and that becomes normal. Like lack of access to fresh air, that becomes normal. The sort of food that's in a prison, that becomes normal. Not giving Muslim people the correct food on Ramadan, that is normal. Not giving Hindu people vegetarian meals, that is normal. Like pepper spraying Black people if they congregate in groups of 3 to watch TV, that is normal, right? Like, this is all not even particularly remarkable. It's just what happens every day inside these walls as a function of the fundamental violence that is prison. There is no nonviolent prison. There is no healthy prison. There is no, you will get the help you need in their prison. There is no, well, great, there's an Indigenous elder, so therefore Indigenous people are being culturally defined in a prison. Let's get more kente on the walls, right? I saw an article in the Globe and Mail this weekend that was talking about culturally sensitive cells, where they put artwork in cells. And I'm like, oh, now when Indigenous people come in the cells, like, there'll be Indigenous artwork. That is fucked up. That is sick. That is a sick culture that's like, instead of not putting Indigenous people in prison, we're going to put Indigenous art on the walls, acknowledging that we're fucking incarcerating Indigenous people, and then pretending that this art will be somehow life or culture giving, with the implication being that actually just go to prison and you'll find your culture and self there. Like, you belong in prison, in other words. This will somehow make you. Sorry, now I'm getting angry. And it's the same thing for Black people. Like, why don't we just have cultural programs in prison? Where we have cultural programs in our lives outside prison, right? So it just becomes this mechanism where people want to, reach into prison and think you can, if we just have more Black guards, if we just have Black wardens, if we just, have like, whatever, a Black mental health program, then it will all be good. And as abolitionists, of course, this is what we're fighting. The Braille, we're building a prison here. Sorry, I'll stop ranting. Vicki, go ahead. But, in the prison that they're building in Cape Breton, in Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia, where I am, the ancestral unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq people. They're like, this is a state-of-the-art prison. There'll be Braille outside every cell. And they'll be wide enough for wheelchairs. So I guess now everybody in a wheelchair can just go to prison, right? People are like, why don't we make special trans prisons, and then so then we can just like keep incarcerating trans people, right? Like this response that people have in Canada in particular. And then you get told that if you don't support the new Braille prison, then you hate people with disabilities and you are the one that's harming people's mental health. Because don't you want the nice mental health prison? Right? Like, so I'm not even like being coherent anymore. I'm just screaming about prison. So I'll throw to Vicki, but I guess that was some snapshots of like, can I say just the complete fuckery that is prison, and that when you deal with it, if you're used to dealing in the free world, the idea that you can like travel for a visit and they make a paperwork error, even though you've been in the car for 12 hours, but they're not going to adjust it. You can't argue with them. You're going home. Like that's the prison. If they lose your number and don't put you on the pin, you ain't getting the visit. If like there's no rationality in that sense. It is a purely irrational space controlled by the whims of violent people who are also as workers caught into a violent system, often from small towns that have been violently stripped of their resources through capitalism, that build the prison and it brings jobs, and then working class white people go and work in the prison to sustain themselves off the lives of Indigenous and Black incarceration. And it just cycles and cycles and cycles. And I will shut up. Sorry. Go ahead, Vicki.
No, thanks, Al. It's really, it was when we were in Australia, we were working on a human rights complaint against the prisons, and they went and built a human rights prison. Of course. But I think it speaks to the pedantic and quotidien. I'm using Sayeda Hartman's work here, but the quotidien violence that we see happening in the prisons. When I talk to folks inside, there's one Métis man, he's been inside for 38 years. You can't imagine, like it's unimaginable trauma that creates for people. And particularly for Black and Indigenous people is that they end up in the most repressive parts of the system, whether it's dangerous offender designations, involuntary transfers, maximum security classification. So they end up in the deepest end of the system, and they're the least likely to get out as well. And they experience all host of day-to-day indignities. But the only kinds of violences that the public tends to focus on are the extreme, and this is again Sayeda Hartman's work, but the extreme incinerations and the extreme violences, and that are only presented through white bodies. So folks like myself, who's able to talk about all the experiences that these Black or Indigenous people are experiencing, and it only gets heard when it's articulated through white bodies with colonial titles. And I think there's a real danger in that, and it's going back to what Elle's been talking about, because we've normalized the violence. We've normalized the violence where certain people, where Indigenous people belong or Black people belong in these kinds of spaces. And the violence that happens to them is completely normalized, as Elle talks about the violence of bureaucracy or the violence of paperwork. If you think about, and Elle was talking about the system itself and how, in the States, they talk about the exceptionalism and incarceration of Black people. But, in Canada, if you actually look at the history of the penitentiary, that the penitentiary was actually too good for Indigenous people when it first started. It was a white civilized, it was at the avant-garde of white civilization. Indigenous people actually weren't allowed in the prison for the most part. In fact, the incarceration rates of Indigenous people were only 1% to 2% well into the 1960s. And they did everything they could to keep Indigenous people out of the penitentiary. They would talk about, and I read the reports dating back from 1838, they talk about Indigenous people's weak constitutions, how they're amenable to reform, and the warders would give them leaves of absence, they'd give them leaves and pardons. They would be pushed out of the prison because they were under this direct carceral responsibility of the Indian agent. But it wasn't until the 1960s where we started to see incarceration rates for Indigenous people increase. Well, around the 1950s, guess what? We also started to see the receding of assimilation policies, right? So here we have, and that's in the post-war area around the so-called human rights, as we're building human rights prisons, around the so-called human rights era, when we started to see the slow, silent movement of Indigenous people from the Indian agent into the prison system. And every year from 1960 onwards, from 1965 onwards, the incarceration rate has increased every single year for Indigenous people. Never once has it decreased, despite all as Elle talked about, indigenizing, introducing all these cultural programming, indigenizing the penitentiary, restorative justice programming, the GLAD-2 and GLAD-2 report writing. Nothing has addressed or changed the rates of incarceration for Indigenous people. And so, and I think part of that is it's the normalizing the quotidien violence, but also naturalizing. We saw this so silent naturalizing of Indigenous people within carceral spaces. It's not a coincidence that as I sit on Abenaki territory, that my friend who's Abenaki just got out of prison last year after 27 years, taken from his mother, put into an adoptive family who was a white military family, ended up in prison, and then this incredibly long, traumatizing experience of 27 years of imprisonment. And yeah, so I think that builds on what Ella's saying, but she says it's so many more better.
First next time.
Yeah, just listening to both of you kind of really pull out that key aspect of the normalization of violence, but particularly the bureaucratization is so distinct. I think what you said as well around just how Canada isn't necessarily unique per se in pulling us away from like perhaps the I guess use this word in the context of the US, but the exceptionalism of, oh no, we're Canada, we're not like them. But to really and to contextualize that or to along in a more global context of what global anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity is just so, it's very, I think it really does. It gives us a lot to kind of go off of in thinking through the carceral logics, perhaps, that kind of goes into the nation building process that has gone into the.
We lost your sound.
Yeah, I think you cut out for a second, Lindsay.
You're muted. There you go.
But yes, just so many thoughts kind of in response to what you're saying, but I guess kind of pushing into our next question, it would be great to hear more about how we can understand these technologies and the intricacies of these technologies and how they become so normalized kind of feed into carceral logics, into carceral logics that institutions uphold, but that also we tend to perpetuate, and then how we can kind of divest from these carceral and colonial logics moving forward. I don't know. Do we want to switch it up and let Vicki start?
Yeah, sure. And I think something that's interesting too, and Vivian Salahana points this out, is that when we make those kinds of shifts from, say, the Indian agent to the prison system, what we saw, at no point was the colonizer ever put on trial for crimes of humanity. Right? At no point have we ever looked to the system to put it on trial, or the people, the slave owners, now warders and jailers, and put them on trial for crimes against humanity. But I think one of the important pieces that, and this is Elle Jones been talking about this, is this idea is that we have to be careful around reforms. And because the system really itself, it's built in, reform is built into its very exercise. It's actually fundamental to the system, and reforms is what gives its vitality. So when Kingston Pen was built in 1835, maybe not even 5 years later, the Brown Commission came out that talked about all the gross violations of human rights and violences and tortures that were happening within the prison system. So, and it's ever since that time, we've been seeing it, all these kinds of commissions come out and changes, but that's what the system was designed to do. It actually feeds off, it's a shapeshifter, and it can change and adapt and meet all these kinds of forms and functions, because it's a 17th century institution. The prison's a 17th century institution. It's archaic, right? It's archaic. And here we are using a 17th century institution, just to give you a small, and yet because we continuously put a lot of investment of our time and energy, it starts to shapeshift. It starts to be everything and anything that everyone wants to be. But at the end of the day, it's a colonizing institution. It'll continue to colonize people's bodies and minds. It has no other function other than that. So, and I think the other thing around this too is, Or just to give you an example of this kind of the archaicness of it, when talking to folks inside, somebody is like, they don't have access, folks inside don't have access to prisons. So they'll do all this kind of, they'll introduce Indigenous culture as long as it's around the programming that corrections wants to introduce. But then I have someone who'd be like, well, do you guys take floppy disks? Floppy disks. They're still like, I don't even use USB keys, let alone floppy disks anymore. So at the same time, on one hand, they're talking about being revolutionizing and changing and adapting, and that it's so how the system itself is continuously keeping people embedded in that space, because there's nowhere else they can be. If you don't even know how to use technology, there's nowhere else you can be other than a prison environment. Because time and time again, you'll get caught, and you'll be criminalized and put back into the system, because there's not much else for you to do outside of that, outside from being in the system. I had another thought, but I lost it, so I'll give it to Elle.
Sorry, and I was like, I was listening to Vicki and nodding, and I forgot what the actual question was. What was the question?
For sure. I guess it would be great to hear both of you kind of in thinking through how all of the technology of the prison plays into nation building and has really come to entrenched and how this is a carceral logic that has become entrenched in institutions more broadly. Like, how can we divest from these carceral and colonial
so Vicki brought this up with the reincarnation of the Indian agent into the prison, right? And as she said, there's never a point where there's a reckoning. Michael Jackson's also talked about this, that reform is part of the prison cycle. It's part of and police as well. It's part of the life of any institution, that part of what's built in is you go into crisis and then you fix it, and that extends your life so what do we see with police, right? When the police are caught racially profiling and we fight for 20 years to get them to stop, or 50 years, whatever we've been fighting, then they need more funding, right? Like, whatever happens, if your crime's committed against you, if a hate crime, if it's by the police, we need more funding to train the police. If the police are racially profiling, they need more funding to hire Black officers. If the police are beating people up, they need more funding, right? Like, no matter what, everything ends in more funding for the police, right? No matter what the crisis is, the answer is more training, more funding, more cameras, more whatever they need. Just give it to them. If we have more officers, maybe they'll stop doing this. And you see the same thing in the prison. Catherine McKittrick talks about the same idea, like the reincarnation of Black death over and over and over again. And, when she talks about the plantation idea, right, that the plantation underlies the modern society in the social arrangements, the economic arrangements, the political arrangements, and this notion of the control and discipline of the undesirables is at the heart of the society. We can go back to like the convoy, when people are like, why aren't they policing them? Because they don't affect the social order. They reinforce the social order. Nobody has a problem with a bunch of angry white men, what Desmond Cole has called the angry white majority, coming and occupy. What do you occupy? You already occupied the city in the first place. Like, Parliament Hill is already an occupation. So like, how are you occupying something you already occupy, right? But this sort of cosplaying as freedom and cosplaying as revolutionary, of course that appeals to the same police who also imagine themselves as action heroes. There's a really good podcast, like Running with Cops. And one of the things it talks about, so it's about Cops, the show. And one of the things it talks about is that Cops has now existed so long that you have cops that grew up watching Cops, which is not a real version of policing, that now enact cops like in real life. This is like Baudrillard, right? That the real and the simulation becomes the real, like it's more real than the real. And like, you see this, right? So it's just so embedded in our ideologies. So the problem for abolitionists is always trying to move away from something that has become so normalized, so embedded. This idea, the only thing we funded since like the 1970s is policing, right? Everything else has been defunded: education, health, like communities, whatever it is, everything's austerity until the police need a budget, and then let's give them everything they want. And that is in a one-to-one relationship with our idea of punishment. The more we rely on the police, the more punishment becomes normalized. The more punishment becomes normalized, the more we call the police. And we just end up in this constant cycle of inflating punishment, increasing punishment. Today's harsh punishment is tomorrow's not harsh enough punishment, right? We've seen this. So the life sentence, Deborah Parks has done this work. She's at UBC, talking about how, when we abolished the death penalty in Canada, we put in the life sentence. And initially it's like 7 to 10 years. And then somebody gets out on parole and kills somebody. So, oh my God, we have to be reactive. And then the life sentence creeps up and we get life 25. And then suddenly 12 years isn't enough and 15 years isn't enough. So now it's like 18 is like the average life sentence. And you have to go for parole like multiple times and you don't get parole on the first try. And the parole board doesn't release their decisions. So we have no idea what they're actually doing and they're completely unaccountable. There's like no oversight. They have what they call a full and complete scheme in place. So you can't habeas them. You can't take them to court. They just get to make their decisions in a black box, much like immigration. The only policing force with like no external oversight in the country is CBSA. And I want us to remember that policing takes place at all these sites, right? So yeah, I mean, like we see that expand and then 25 years isn't enough. So, oh no, and this is the problem because then we get Bissonnette and should we give him 7 life sentences? And it's very hard as an abolitionist to step in and say, no, that is not the solution. When, of course, there's a Muslim community that is rightfully recognizing the atrocity here, that is recognizing that this is embedded in Islamophobia that has been stoked by like so many forces in this country, the discourse of anti-immigration, of Canadian values, of post 9/11, all of these things. But it becomes hard, right, to stand up and say, no, I have to argue that Bissonnette should also not have this kind of sentence. And yes, not the traffickers of Black women who also murder and kill Black women, not them either. And like, no, not the person who kills Indigenous women. And that is really difficult, right, as abolitionists to move away from that. One of the things that a lot of us that work in this space always say is everybody kind of has their line, right? Like you go in and usually often you're starting with some like case that's you sympathize with. Like you're like, okay, he's a child refugee. Oh, it's a wrongful conviction. And then, as you move further and further, you start to deal with the people that nobody wants to deal with, the dangerous offenders, the people who have murdered Indigenous and Black women, the people who did murder a sex worker, and everybody has a kind of crisis where you're like, what do I do? This person's a pedophile. And their rights are being messed with, but I'm like deeply uncomfortable, obviously. Like I'm not trying to, like, I don't empathize with this, but I have to stand on this principle of the rights because, of course, if we can strip that, nobody cares about Paul Bernardo's rights, obviously, but the problem is what happens to him today then becomes normal for everybody else, right? The sentence given today becomes the sentence for Indigenous people. I mean, you can look at dangerous offenders where we look at like white men to be dangerous offenders have to be like Paul Bernardo, Clifford Olson, they have to be serial killers. And Indigenous people have 2 repeat offenses. Like maybe you had a knife offense and then you had an attempted murder with a knife. That's enough. And so 30% of dangerous offenders plus in Canada are Indigenous men, and they're not serial killers. There's no Indigenous serial killers. I think every single woman who's a dangerous offender in Canada, except maybe one, has been an Indigenous woman, and not a single one of them committed a violent crime before they went to prison. I expect to see all kinds of trans dangerous offenders coming up soon, right? Like it's inevitable, right? So the problem is that you have to stand on that principle and say, as people tell you that you love murderers and you love pedophiles and you want rapists running our streets, and what kind of monster are you because you're willing to take the call from this monster, right? We have to avoid that monsterization and really think about what is being accomplished here. And nobody thinks that somebody like Paul Bernardo shouldn't be somewhere away from people because he is dangerous. But that doesn't have to look like mass incarceration. It doesn't have to look like the way the prison space looks. There are other ways, right? And the problem for us as abolitionists is to enter a very complex space that we have all struggled with. We don't just step into the space and like you're cool talking to a pedophile, right? Like that's just not how it works. It's a lot of self-reflection and dealing and thinking about it and challenging yourself and being shocked and, really feeling uncomfortable, all these things, because it is nuanced work. It's not a hashtag. It's not just hashtag abolition. I'm an abolitionist. You will always have your moment where you're like, fuck, I don't believe in prisons, but that person should be in prison, right? You will have that moment all the time. You will have the moments where you are harmed. You will have all of that stuff happening. And as abolitionists, we have to work in complex ways. And because we want to be complex, it's been easy to just say, well, you love murderers. And like you're putting somebody on the spot and then you sound crazy because you love murderers, right? And we have to resist that kind of simple discourse and really think about, where does harm come from? How do we address harm? Is what we're doing addressing harm? Do we have to love and be comfortable with or even support somebody to understand that their rights have to exist? Don't rights belong to those who are the most violent and the most, despised among us? Yes, the cops that kill Black people also deserve abolitionists. Like we also have to think of that as abolitionists. What does it mean to call for the cops who kill Black people to go to prison? And we have to resist it. We have to resist it. And it is complicated. It is an everyday work. It is the work of constantly fighting what you think you believe and constantly having to challenge yourself. Bell Hooks tells us when you live in a society based on domination, you will fail your own values at every point. And that is true. And it's not about purity, and it's not about like, I'm a better abolitionist than you, and I'm a better abolitionist because I advocate for this. It's really difficult work. It's traumatic work for everybody, but it's the work of trying to build something other, trying to move outside of something that's become so normalized that we literally cannot think our way around it, that we all default into it, that we all at some points punish people, as Mariam Kaba says, the cop in our head and the cop in our heart, right? So I don't know. I mean, I can go on about this. Sorry, Vicki, you take this back. You can't get me started. I go on these long rants and I try and stop myself, and then 60 ideas come to me. So Vicki, you go ahead. Next.
Well, thank you so much, Elle. I was actually going to say that we could transition into our last question, just as we're kind of running out of time. But it really resonated with me, like what you were saying, Elle, about really learning to move away and kind of divest from these carceral logics is really hard when you're dealing with all number of offenders who have hurt racialized communities in so many different ways. But it's really, it's obviously incredibly essential for this work. And so kind of as a segue, as a kind of, way to divest from these carceral logics, we were kind of wondering, and I wanted to ask you both, kind of what are your strategies or how we can kind of build long-term and sustained solidarity with people who are deeply othered from society, such as incarcerated and detained people? And since we don't have as much time, I'll maybe just let you both give a short answer, and then we'll try and move into the Q&A. Vicki, did you want to jump into it?
Yeah, sure. Hopefully, I'm pretty sure, but just to pick up from what Elle was saying, because I have a 5-year-old daughter, right? And I'm not deluded into believing that somehow the prison's what keeping her safe, right? I know that it's the institutions in which she goes into that cultivate her as a 5-year-old. It's the connections. Those are the things that keep her safe. Like, it's community. So I'm not deluded into believing that the prisons keep us safe. But speaking of kind of like, how do you stay in solidarity? But I think you have to be in community. And, a lot of people, Elle was saying, we just let, you let all these people out of prisons and there's violence. You want to go somewhere where you think that where justice doesn't happen, go into indigenous communities. All you have to do is read the transcripts of the missing and murdered inquiry to know the levels and layers of which there is no justice, in which the police, I've been in areas where police won't even go on reserve. They just won't even bother going on reserve, right? So, and when they do go on reserve or they do go in community, it's in an invasive and violent way. So we know places where policing and prisons don't exist. It's not some ideological world. Indigenous communities have been doing that for a long time. And some of our own work has been to start. I work with a grassroots activist named she's Gladys Radek, who's Gitsan Wet'suwet'en. And she's been doing a lot of work for the missing and murdered and the families and the communities. And we started documenting all the grassroots initiatives, and we've collected well over 500 initiatives of how families have been addressing the murders and disappearances in the lack and absence of policing and justice, or at worst case where it's invasive and violent. And what we see and what we've been learning from these communities is that justice is and needs many, many things. And it's well beyond the imaginaries of what a state or the police or prisons can provide. And I'll give a couple examples. So, I've heard Elle talk about Bear Clan Patrol in Winnipeg. Well, Bear Clan Patrol actually predates Neighborhood Watch. And it actually started with a group of Indigenous women in the north end of Winnipeg and Native youth groups who would walk the streets to make sure that the women were safe. And they'd hold vigils at night, right, in memory of the women. And we have another group in Winnipeg called Drag the Red. And what Drag the Red did, after a young woman's body was found in the Red River in Winnipeg, they asked the police to continue searching to see if they could find anything else. And the police refused because they said it would be ineffective and inefficient. Well, if your monofunction is to solve cases, yeah, it would be ineffective and inefficient. So what the community members did, Bernadette Smith and some other folks, they got together, they pooled their resources, they off search and training, they off search training, they developed banners for families, they provided food and lodging, they kept hope alive, they built community, right? So they, when family members didn't have a place to stay, they'd offer lodging. Like it was an incredible pooling of community. And I think that's what's showing us what justice needs. It needs community, it needs healing, it needs accountability, it needs, support, it needs a whole bunch of things more than what the policing and punishment, policing and prisons can provide. In addition to that, we're not talking about something that's in some faraway land or something that's idealized. And abolitionists always get accused of being idealists or radical. And radical is okay. I think we need radical ideas, but this is happening in our own backyard. And so right now we're putting together all these different kinds of models of what justice can and does look like right here in Canada. Right, not in some idealized form, or even trying to go back to unburied tradition or ceremony, even though that could be a part of it. It's happening right here, right now, and no one even sees it. Right, so it's like it just shows. It speaks to that sort of like that normalizing violence and ignoring all the incredible resilience and resurgence that we see happening elsewhere.
Yeah, I always say, like, we're not abolitionists because we're naive. We're abolitionists because we've encountered the prison, because we've encountered violence. Transformative justice is designed and built by Black women who are victims of childhood sexual assault, who are victims of mass violence, and recognize that the white supremacist police force in prison is not going to bring you that healing. That does not mean, though, that of course we are naive or have to ignore harm or just forgive people or just move on. This kind of rhetoric that particularly is given to victims, right? Rachel Zellas always says, if aliens came down and removed the prison tomorrow, we ain't ready. We can't even hold the rapists in our friends groups accountable yet, Like, we all say that we're anti-this and anti-that until somebody that we ride with or our crew or someone we're close to, and then we all show the failure of even being able to hold people accountable in small ways, never mind on this large level. So what we have to do is prepare ourselves for that work that we are not prepared to do, because we are not taught how to deal with conflict. We are not taught how to stand, how to hold those we love accountable, and that we can both care and love somebody and recognize that they are a harmful person and what that means. We don't know how to do any of that work. It's not taught to us. So we have to begin that work. And it begins, as Vicki said, like, there's already models. People often talk about imagining the world we want to see. And I understand why we use that language, but then we concede the idea that it's imaginary when in fact it's real. In COVID, in the first wave in my province, we let out 41% of people from provincial jail and nothing happened. There was no crime wave. And if you care about economy, it was less than half the cost of keeping people in jail. So it just showed the myth, right? That it's prison that's the myth. The radical thing has been transforming our society in this, like, in neoliberal capitalist way since the 1970s in particular. That is radical. Relying on the police to police the house less is radical. Those are the radical things. It's just they're treated as normal. And just very briefly, when we did the defunding report, now because people can't lampoon it as crazy, they're trying to say that we made conservative. Some conservatives said we made conservative recommendations. Like, well, maybe they are. But then why are you honking your horn and shitting on people instead of demanding, like, these policies, right? If you think they're so conservative. So I think that it's very practical. We fight for everyday practical abolition, whether that's forming a tenancy group in your building and, fighting your landlord, whether that's bringing each other food and groceries, and as we all did in COVID, as people realized we had to rely on each other, whether that's what Indigenous women in Winnipeg did when they came to the hospitals and stood in front of people who were having the babies taken and said, you're not taking this baby from the hospital, whether that's like people patrolling their own neighborhoods and building those relationships and non-violently patrolling, getting to know your neighbors and building those things up, whether that's having a dinner with Black women and talking about sexual violence in our communities and opening up that conversation. These are all part of abolition. There's the big project that we will not see in our lifetimes, I imagine, just like our enslaved ancestors didn't see freedom in their lifetimes, but they work towards it. There's so many things that we can do. So I think for abolition as a practical project, it's, like getting into your community and neighborhood, getting into your family, and really starting to deal with conflict, deal with harm, build up the structures that teach us to do things other ways, learning how to intervene in domestic violence by ourselves, and then make sure that abuser does not come back. If we say to somebody, you are not welcome in community events until you do X, Y, Z, enforcing it. These things are so difficult and they take a lot of time. So it's easier often to default to something easier, which is the police. So we have to do that hard work to say, if we believe in this, then we have to fight. We can't just throw up our hands and say, well, what can you do? Like the cops, can't call the cops, but sexual violence is just around, right? Like you have to actually engage with it and fight it. And so as Vicki beautifully said, there's many practical ways to do this. I'm stopping talking. Question time.
Oh, thank you so much.
Run-on sentences.
We actually, we have our first question. I think David's gonna show it up on the screen.
So would you be able to speak? So Taylor's asking, can you speak to some alternatives to the carceral system that abolitionists would advocate for? I know that you did start to riff off a couple that were all really, really great to think through, but would there be any others that either of you could have seen in your work that you feel have been really effective and so on?
I mean, there are pitfalls. Like what you always have to be is the difference between how the system takes it. So, I mean, the Creating Choices report is a great example where we were like, women need to have responsibility and give an agency over their lives, which turned into it's your fault if you commit a crime responsibility, right? So when we advocate community sentences, that becomes community surveillance. Monitoring bracelets, for example, are just becoming now like normalized, and you have to pay for them yourself, right? So part of the problem is we say we want people in community, and they're like, well, we will let them in community with a bracelet, and then your home turns into a prison, right? So the true alternative is that community, going out on the land, committing, working with your elders, reparation circles, transformative circles, where people make reparation to their community, fighting the roots of violence. So that means dealing with gendered violence, homophobia, transphobia in our communities. It means having those direct conversations. Like if you're a Black woman, you know that there's violence in our community. How do we address that without, going to the police, right? We have to learn how to talk about that. But we can do this work in community. We know that we can, but we can't just, I'm not naive about it. I wouldn't be like, oh yeah, I know how to just stop a bunch of serial rapists, put me there, right? We don't know those things, but we have to, we have the skills. What did our ancestors do? Our grandmothers had to deal with harm with no access to the systems. Like my grandmother grew up in a colonial country. There was no policing coming. So they worked together as women. Women had a tradition of if someone was abusing another woman, the woman would go and basically fuck that man up and refuse to trade with him. And you're not coming in any business. And they would sing songs at the person and shame them publicly and then make demands. There's so many traditions in indigenous cultures around the world where women had these councils and knew how to take care of this stuff. So it's not new. And then we can put in our own spins on this. So we should be advocating, and we should always be advocating away from the courts. Can this be done in community? Well, can we put a bail circle in place? Well, can we put an accountability circle in place? But we have to be ready. It's too that you cannot commit to it you can't be like, I'll do a transformative justice circle with this person who raped somebody, and then you fumble it, right? That is so harmful to the victim. It's harmful to everybody. So we also have to be training each other in this stuff. So it begins with training each other in transformative justice, training each other in intervening in violence, training each other in holding in accountability, training our communities, right? That is also the work so that we're ready to receive when it comes, because otherwise then we're scrambling. So, it's unlimited, supported housing, anything that you can think of that is not a prison or a police thing, do that. But you can't just walk into it and think, oh, I'm going to, today I haven't done anything, and then tomorrow I'm going to be dealing with a violent person, because then we will be spreading violence and it's not helpful. So we also have to really think about, what does accountability look like? How do we really address harm? How do we take harm on? How do we sit with harm? And what does that actually mean? And so we also have to be honest with ourselves around our capacities as well, which is abolitionist work.
Thank you so much for answering that. I am unfortunately conscious of the time. So I don't know, Vicki, if you have anything else to add to what I was saying.
I'll just say a really quick story, because it reminded me when I was in Malaysia, I was in the markets, and a Malay man had pinched my butt. And, I used to work in a bar, and, someone pinched my butt and people around would just laugh, or was accepted. And, but when I was in Malaysia, the woman there, a woman there saw it, and then she started shaming him. And then the other women saw that she was doing that, and they all started shaming him, and he quickly walked off, right? But it's a culture that doesn't tolerate those kinds of, the kind of sexual violence. And I bet you any money that Malaysia has a much lower rates of sexual violence when those kinds of things are not tolerated. So it's just about, I really think we need to build being in community and building these mechanisms of accountability where you don't necessarily have to hold other people to account, because you may not even know who did it or whatever happened, but at least there's all these safeguards in place that's going to protect and make sure that people are safe. Whether it's for night passage in Portage la Prairie, where Indigenous woman has a safe house where if women are walking the highway at night, they can go to her place at any time. Like, I think those are the kinds of vital things that we really need in place, and that creates a culture of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. I'm just looking through the rest of the questions. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time, but I did want to just kind of read off them, and hopefully we can kind of take that away and continue to think through how we can take on what has been discussed here today. So Poahi was asking about the training that Canadian officers receive around crisis intervention, particularly considering that she's worked for 16 years in a mental health facility and had much better skills in de-escalation tactics. Anna was asking about how the law will play a major role in facilitating abolition, particularly if, say, a legal challenge were to be brought. How will this work if legal change depends on action being initiated by the ruling class benefit from this racially capitalized system? So unfortunately, we don't have the time, but if there are, if there are any ways for them to sort of follow your work and to maybe read up more about these kinds of things, please do mention them, I guess.
Just quickly, in terms of the law, the field of prison law is interesting here. So like things like habeas corpus applications, like really creative ways of trying to challenge the system and that take these small steps. So in Nova Scotia, prisoners were taught how to do their own habeases so they can challenge. It's an emergency application to the court that challenges your conditions. So now everyone's like filing mad habeases. So like there are things that exist within the law, particularly in the field of prison law, where people try to intervene in the space. And yes, you're using these colonial like tools, you're using the charter, but it can, when lawyers do that, it can be very effective. I mean, we fought Abdul in court and won, right? So we need lawyers that are committed to these also creative abolitionist tools, that are willing to do the pro bono work, that then can get these decisions that then challenge and be built off of, recognizing it's a step, not the full thing.
That's great.
Well, yeah, we're obviously out of time for today's panel, but we just wanted to thank both of you so much for both of your insights and for making time to be here today. And actually, before we conclude the panel, we just want to quickly spotlight the next event for the series, which hopefully you can all attend, as well as the creative submissions that we have. So the next talk in the Just Futures series, it'll feature Dylan Rodriguez and Leah Lakshmi Pipenza Samar Sinha, and will be held on March 14th from 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So this same time in March. So we hope that as many of you can join us there in kind of furthering these discussions. And the last thing we wanted to kind of spotlight is throughout this series, we were hoping to, we are calling for creative submissions in response to any of the main themes from the panels. And so for the first one, we are looking for submissions that correspond with the theme of imagining a world without police and prisons. And these can be either a 750-word, like roughly written piece, or any kind of multimedia artwork. Yeah, also, so for more information on these submissions, or also for the future talks, you can also go to our website, which is justfuturesubc.wordpress.com. And I think we can here link that in the comments. And I think apart from that, I just want to also lastly thank my co-panelist Lindsay for her hard work today, and to David for kind of running everything on the back end, and also just to all of our other GSA folks that have kind of made this first panel series possible. So yeah, thank you to everyone, and yeah, we look forward to seeing everyone hopefully in March for the next one. And yeah, have a great Monday afternoon or evening.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.